So this is a project that I've been working on for like over a decade, actually, since I was a PhD student. And this is joint work with Hannah Waite, who's at the University of Oregon, Yi Nguyen, who's a recent PhD graduate from our program here, and Brandon Stewart, who's a professor at Princeton. This actually just got published in PNAS yesterday, so I'm happy to share it. So I think the big sort of broad question, and the way I kind of want to connect it maybe to some of the questions that you all have been thinking about in design and in media, is how do we tell when media is state scripted, right? So we have media kind of coming at us all the time from all over the place. How do we tell when there's sort of a coordinated information campaign? How do we tell when there's a political, information campaign in media? And of course, we know, and there's been a lot of work on propaganda campaigns or coordinated information campaigns in new media, right? We know that state information campaigns are prevalent on social media. There's been a lot of discussion about that. But we also know that they're really hard to identify because they're more effective when they blend in, right? So if if a coordinated information campaign has a little thing that says, this is coordinated by, some state government, that's not going to be as effective, right, as something that blends in. And so it's really difficult for researchers and others, journalists, other actors, to identify these information campaigns. And some campaigns have been identified by leaks. Some have been identified by platforms. Some have been identified by, lots of painstaking investigative journalism, right? But a lot of what we look at state information campaigns online they're sort of based on guesses, right? Like that content looks like maybe it's sponsored by a state, or, a coordinated information campaign, or that source is probably, that everything coming from that source is definitely from a state information campaign. And those are sort of guesses about actually the origin of that material. And so how do we really identify, and in this kind of overload information environment, how do we identify when things are coming from the state but are trying to sort of blend in? And so I would argue that this is actually kind of not a new problem, and we're going to kind of look at it through the lens of traditional media in China, but I think you could look at it through a lens of a variety of other contexts. This is not just specific to China, but we're going to use China as a way to think about this. I'm going to argue that state influence is also obscure sometimes in traditional media as well, and we're going to sort of use a method to try to identify that influence. So just to give you some context, media in China, traditional media in China, newspapers under Mao, so before reform and opening up, were completely state controlled. So you knew that information in the media at that time point was coming from the state, right? But the media market in China commercialized really greatly within the 1990s and the 2000s and the 1980s as well, where there was a lot of the state really loosened its grip on the media, and news was not only driven by what the state wanted, but also by what the market wanted, what people wanted to read, right? And so there was an increasing turn toward attracting readership, and there's this whole literature on the commercialization of media in China in the 1980s and up to the 2000s. So there's an increasing commercialization of the media. At the same time, you still had propaganda departments at the local and central level that had ultimate control over content. So if there was something they objected to, they had control over licensing of journalists, over pre-publication review. So, if there's an article that was objected to, could get taken out. And also through directives, like you cannot publish on this topic, or you must publish following this particular script. So the mixing of this news aimed to increase engagement, and news directed by the state made this kind of state-driven news really difficult to identify. And there's a huge literature in political science about this. So a big discussion during this time period in the political science literature over what was the influence of commercialization on state control, and how did commercialization of the media in China influence what was printed in the news, and also how people interpreted it, or whether they could distinguish between state versus commercialized control. So what UCSD professor Susan Shirk has this book where she argues that competition for audiences during this time period of increasing commercialization provided a strong motivation for the press to break a news story before the propaganda authorities could ban it. So there was a lot of moments during this time period where newspapers would try to get out in front of the propaganda authorities to print something beforehand so that their audiences would, buy their paper, right? And they could, and so there were a lot of these arguments that commercialization sort of undermined the capability of the state to control the media during that time period. There are other arguments. So this is Danielle Stockman wrote a book about how actually, though, commercialization made propaganda and state control of media sort of blend in. So she argues that the commercialized look, or the branding of marketized media, induces readers to perceive media sources as more credible, so that the state could kind of put articles within commercialized media that looked credible, even though they were actually and because people didn't know that they were being driven by the state rather than the market. This was also the argument of another scholar, Anne-Marie Brady, who argued that China's propaganda system has deliberately absorbed the methodology of political public relations, mass communications, and other methods of mass persuasion, blending in with commercialized media in order to not distinguish from this more commercialized turn. So how do we measure this? So there's been a lot of efforts within the political science literature and others to sort of measure, okay, what is propaganda in news, traditional media within China? What is state-driven versus what is market-driven? And we kind of come up with a little bit of a new approach, which is more of a process-oriented approach of measuring propaganda. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to do in this talk, is use what we know about the political process of propaganda and with a data set of leaks of propaganda directives to match the pattern of what we know is propaganda with the pattern of the news. And then to be able to identify propaganda scripting at scale in a decade of newspaper articles in China. And then we'll be able to look and see how this is changing over the last 10 years, which we have data on, and then also whether or not commercialized media actually is effective at producing a more sort of independent version of certain events. So we're going to rely on these leaked directives that come from a website called China Digital Times, which is not a random sample of propaganda directives in China, but gives us some information of when the state has intervened in traditional media. So this is one example of translated propaganda directive, which said, the State Council recently endorsed several points on deepening income distribution reform. All media are to cover this according to the Xinhua wire copy. So Xinhua is like state media in China. Do not change the headlines, put the story on the front page, or lure readers to it. Except for the wire copy, do not produce any other form of report, commentary, or link. Do not post it on the media's official Weibo account, okay? So there are a lot of instructions here. First of all, you can only print this according to Xinhua's wire copy, and you're not supposed to promote it, okay? So we can then take this directive and look within our data and see exactly how newspapers responded to it, right? So the propaganda department is issuing this directive to the newspapers. Some of these are censorship directives, which means don't print. But some of these are what we call propaganda directives, meaning you must print. So you have to print according to a particular copy. And some of them may contain both. In our case, when we look in our newspaper data set, almost all of the newspapers followed this directive. So we found the Xinhua wire copy reporting on this event, and we look and see how much sort of overlap there is with the Xinhua wire copy and what the newspapers are printing on this event, and they're following this directive. Okay. None of the newspapers in our data set put this on the front page, and about a third of them did actually change the title though. So we do find instances where the media is changing or adapting the directive in certain ways. So today what I'm going to do is develop this method of identifying scripted propaganda by linking to the leaked propaganda directives, then validate this method with newspaper articles linked to leaked propaganda directives. And because we have this news data set that starts in 2012, we're able to see how scripted propaganda has changed since 2012, which is when Xi Jinping took power in China. And we find, first of all, that scripted propaganda is increasing in traditional media and the share of total articles. It's also increasing in constraint, so I'll show this to you later, which means that their newspapers are more closely following directives than they were in the past, that it's increasingly ideological, and that the influence of scripted propaganda really does extend also to more commercialized papers. So unlike some of the literature in the past, we find that that commercial papers follow these directives a little bit less, but fairly similarly to the more party papers. And then we also do a zoom in looking at the early days of COVID-19 pandemic and how this mechanism was used to control media messaging at this time period. Okay, so I'll start in with how do we identify scripted propaganda in these newspapers. So again, we have these directives. So this is another example, Central Ministry of Publicity concerning the school knife attack in Henan, and all related reports strictly follow the Xinhua manuscripts. Do not put articles on the front page. Do not pursue any other reports or opinions by yourselves. So for this propaganda directive, we identified 9 Xinhua scripts during this time period that are about this event. And so this is one of the, a snippet of a translation of one of those scripts. And what we can then do is find how much newspaper articles that heavily take from those scripts. So this is an article where the red here are the ones that overlap with this particular script. There is some changes, and we can actually, a lot of the articles adapt to these scripts, which is quite interesting. But we're able to look. We have sort of we got a whole bunch of RAs together to tell us how much copying is really like following very substantively the script, and so we're able to get a pretty precise measure of extensive copying of a particular script. So then we can do this in our entire newspaper database, and we can see sort of all of the different newspapers and how they follow the scripts slightly differently. And all of these, what's interesting is that all of these newspapers also have lots of overlap with each other. So already you're going to kind of see how we're eventually going to identify newspapers that are following propaganda directives that we don't have, is that we can kind of reverse this logic. So if we see lots of newspapers printing exactly the same thing, we are going to use that later as a measure of there being a directive that we don't see. Okay, because we don't have all directives. Okay, so we obtain over 1,000 leaked media directives from China Digital Times, and 251 of these are propaganda directives, meaning that they're saying that the newspaper should follow a particular script. 97 of these are scripting from Xinhua News about domestic news, so those are the ones that we focus on. So we take those 97 directives, and then we identified Xinhua scripts for 72 of the 97. So we did this all by hand as a lot of a big team. And we then link these with actual newspaper coverage. So more on that in a second. So before I go into how we link them, I'm going to describe the newspaper corpus itself and how we're collecting it. So we collected a corpus of over 9 million articles. 35 of these are party papers, so these are official newspapers that are more state-controlled. These party papers cover 18 out of 22 provinces, so they're mostly local papers in all 5 autonomous regions in China. And then we also have 11 commercial papers, so these are papers that have less state control. And these cover about 8 of 22 provinces, and they're oversampled on Shanghai, Guangdong, and Beijing. We collected the party papers by scraping them daily from 2012 all the way to 2022. The commercial papers are actually purchased from a third-party vendor. So how do we estimate? So what we're going to do is we're going to take articles from every day within our corpus. So imagine each of these dots is an article in an imaginary space on a particular day. And what we can do is between every pair of articles on that day, we can estimate a measure of text similarity, okay? So there are lots of different measures of similarity that you could pick depending on what you're interested in. We found that trigram cosine similarity between these articles actually gave us a really good measure of extensive copying or extensive reuse of articles. And so, you could, for every one of these nodes and every one of these edges represents some measure of similarity. So most of these have actually quite low similarity. These are purple, right? But if you kind of look, there's a little bit of green at the very top. Some of them have quite high similarity to each other. Now we had all of these RAs, as I mentioned earlier, read a whole bunch of these different pairs and tell us when the pairs had significant overlap with each other. And then based on that hand coding, we developed a metric saying, okay, any similarity above 0.55, that was like the magic number, was copying versus the ones below was not copying. So imagine that we erase all of these nodes that are below 0.55. Then what we get is clusters of articles that have extensive copying between each other. And these articles here are related to one another through extensive text reuse. These articles are much closer, right? Have a much closer relationship than these articles. And then there's a lot of clusters that are just a couple papers that are really kind of have similarities to each other. So this is one day of news articles, and they're sort of copying of one another. And so we're able to then identify what we call clusters. So and I also removed all the nodes that didn't have any copying. So clusters of articles are articles that are all connected to one another through this similarity metric. These are all clusters. So of course, there are 2 reasons why we might end up with this clustering in media, right? One of the reasons is syndication. So this is a very natural process in the news media. Say the AP in the US, right, is copied a lot or not, taken by other news media organizations. They pay the AP a little bit, and then they reprint their article instead of having to write a whole new article, right? So syndication is where newspapers reprint articles for commercials or access reasons, right? They may not have a journalist on the ground, so they need to reprint it on their own. Or it could be propaganda scripting, which I've been talking about, right? Where newspapers are directed to reprint the article. So how can we distinguish between these 2 cases? So what we did is, it just really jumps out within the data is that the articles that we know were scripted, so we have those 72 scripts that we know come from a directive, those articles end up matching to very large clusters, okay? At like 17 times the rate of other articles. So it's really, really different. So 77.7% of script matched articles are in clusters above size 10. Okay, so very much the cluster size predicts whether or not it's related to at least our sample of scripted of leaked media archives, versus only 5% of the same size random sample of non-marched articles are in clusters of size 10 from the same time period. So actually just in our data set of 46 newspaper articles, you can use this 10 threshold as a good rule of thumb indicator of these articles are much, much more likely to be scripted by the state than these articles, and really remove a lot of the data while still capturing a lot of those scripted articles. So you can kind of think about this through like this precision and recall framework that we think about in identifying anything from a rule, right? So ours, we're not using an algorithm to identify scripted versus non-scripted propaganda, but we are using this rule where we say if it's in a cluster above size 10, we think it's scripted. If it's not, we think it's likely not scripted. So we can think about trying to measure recall. So how many of truly scripted articles do we think we are getting with this rule, right? And so we can calculate that by the set of articles that we've matched to propaganda directives. And 78% of the matched articles, as I said before, were in a cluster of size 10 plus. But also 89% of our leaked directives have at least one cluster matched to them with a size 10 plus, okay? So that means that we can capture almost 90% of the leaked directives just by this one rule about cluster size. But then you might worry about precision, which is, well, you say all of these articles that are in size 10 plus are scripted, but are they actually, might you be getting syndicated clusters that are just very large? So this is very difficult to approximate because we don't have all of the scripted, all of these leaked, all of the directives, right? So we can only approximate this with a very loose lower bound. But what we did is we took events related to the script and we used keywords to search for all of the articles about those events. And then we said, okay, all of the articles that we identified that were about that event, how many of them were in a cluster of size 10 plus, okay? And almost over 50% of them were in a cluster above 10 plus, copied from a matched script, and were over 50% of them actually copied from one of the scripts that we had, and over 69% of them were in a cluster that matched to a script. So they may not have matched the script themselves, but they matched to an article that also matched to a script. So we think we're actually getting pretty high precision too, although our precision may be a little lower than our recall. And the other metric we use to try to validate this is a placebo test. So we said, okay, so there are topics that we don't think would be state scripted, like weather or soccer. We don't think that maybe these are going to be subject to propaganda directives. Maybe in very specific cases like the Olympics or major cyclones or something, but probably not much of this would be. And so we used some keywords to search for weather articles and soccer articles within our corpus. And we found that a very small proportion end up in size 10 plus clusters. So we have, versus 5% of all articles are ending up in those clusters. And the other thing that we looked at was I can go into this more later, we had, for a different project, this huge data set of English language news coverage of the Ukraine war, which is a data set that you might expect might have a lot of large clusters of syndication, but we found almost 0% in a very similar number of newspaper database. We found very few of these large clusters. So we think in other media contexts, we don't see that kind of scripting, top-down directed scripting. It also makes us think that these large clusters are not a result of syndication, that we think they're more directed. So then we're able to use this very simple rule. Does the cluster fall over 10 unique newspapers printing on the same thing or not, to sort of extrapolate to our larger data set and try to predict what other propaganda articles are there in the whole newspaper data set. And what we find is that scripted propaganda first is increasing as a share of total articles under Xi Jinping, which is what we expect from anecdotal reports of an increased media crackdown over the last 10 years. But no one has really measured this at scale. So we think it's kind of interesting that it accords with what we think we know. We also find that scripted propaganda is increasing in constraint, and that it's targeting highly sensitive issues, especially ideology, and that its influences in commercial papers as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about the case study of COVID-19. So first, I just want to show you that scripted propaganda is increasing in share. And part of this is driven by the fact that actually each newspaper is actually printing fewer articles overall over this time period. So at first we thought this was just like a problem with our scraping, but we validated this in other data sets as well, is our newspapers in general are posting kind of fewer articles and fewer articles over these last 10 years, which is interesting in itself, but that the number of articles in clusters, in large clusters, is staying pretty constant throughout the time period. So overall, the total number of scripted articles is not increasing, but as a share, it is over this time period. Perhaps most dramatically, though, scripted articles are appearing much, much more on the front page of newspapers. So in 2012, we see like 5% of articles on the front page of newspapers were in those clusters of 10 plus, whereas now it's coming something more like 15%. Okay, 12, 15%. So it's really, we see a much, much greater increase in the prominence of this scripted media. The other thing that we think is really interesting is scripted articles really spike during political meetings. There are huge spikes on particular days that are very, very sensitive in the political calendar. So for example, you can have days where something like 30% of all articles within newspapers are scripted. And those tend to coincide with things like party congresses or the two sessions, which are big political meetings, national political meetings in China. And especially the meetings that happened in the end of 2017 and the beginning of 2018. Those were particularly highly scripted events. This is when the sort of constitution was changed to extend the term limit, so these were like really highly politically sensitive moments in politics in China, which also gives us some, I think, face validity of our measure. We also see that propaganda is increasing in its constraint, which accords with what we hear in general from media in China that it's become more constrained overall across this time period. So here on the y-axis is the percent of sentences that are unadapted for articles that appear in those 10 clusters. So we look at all of the sentences in those 10 plus clusters, and we say, okay, how many of those are different, are unique in that cluster, okay? And then those are adapted sentences. So those are sentences where the newspaper is like adding its own sentence. 80% of them are unadapted, so that's like strict copying in 2012, and that's really increasing to almost 90% in 2022. So we see that journalists are a lot more strictly following these rules over this time period. Okay, so then we ran this huge topic model because we were like, what kinds of things are scripted? This huge topic model on all of the newspaper articles, and we said, okay, what are the? And then and these are like we grouped them into like larger topics so that we could really get sort of themes. We say, what are the articles? What are the differences in articles that appear in these scripted clusters versus these more unclustered articles? So yellow is the proportion of clustered articles assigned to a particular topic, and green is the proportion of unclustered articles assigned to a particular topic. So like diplomacy, for example, the yellow is much higher than the green. Those are much more likely to be scripted, right? Same with hard propaganda, which is like ideology, national politics, international events, economic policies. Same with crisis, laws and regulations. Things that are less likely to appear in scripted clusters are entertainment, business and finance, charities, stories, non-political topics generally, and local politics, okay? So this is also sort of accords with what we know about propaganda in China, but I think it also brings out some things that you might not think would be scripted, like crisis is definitely something that's very scripted under these. So then we looked at, okay, what are the differences between commercial and party papers in terms of scripting? So this is, the blue line is commercial, the proportion of articles in the commercial papers that we have that are scripted, where the red line is the proportion in the party papers that are scripted. So we definitely see that commercial papers overall, they have fewer articles as a proportion that are scripted within the news, although they're still spiking kind of at the same time periods, right, during these big party meetings. But a lot of that is coming from the fact that commercial papers are reporting more on different topics than party papers. So here at the top, the party papers are in red and the commercial papers are in blue. You see that they have this same pattern where these sort of national politics, economic policies, crises are more scripted than these other things like entertainment or non-political topics. That's true in both commercial and party papers. But commercial papers are just much more likely, so on the bottom here is the proportion of that topic in commercial and party papers, not scripted or non-scripted, right? And what we see is commercial papers are just much more likely to report on business and finance, entertainment, things like non-political topics, right? And so the difference in scripting is not coming from necessarily commercial papers breaking a really sensitive story, but instead they're just focusing on like a wholly different topic. Okay, so now what's interesting about this method is it allows us to zoom in on a lot of different topics, and there's so many different topics to zoom in on, but just for today and in the paper, we just start by zooming in on understanding reporting in the early days of COVID-19. So you might remember, so this is interest in COVID-19 as a measured through Baidu search. So Baidu is like one of the biggest search engines in China. And this is Baidu search for Wuhan pneumonia, which is what people were searching for at the time, right? Obviously, this isn't the official name that ended up, but at the time this is, and one thing that just to remind you of is there was a lot of discussion about COVID in late December, right? That was sort of shut down at the time period, at that time period. So there was actually a spike in search that we see in late December. And so one thing that these arguments about commercialization of media would argue is that, commercialized media might have an incentive to pick up on this and report on it in order to attract an audience, right? Or do we see the scripting kind of having more control? So one question that we had was, does commercialized media, are they able to sort of report on this early? And really the answer is no, that scripting really has such forceful control during this time period over this topic. We don't see commercialized media preempting this topic at all. So we purchased this huge data set from over 707 newspapers. So this is a much bigger data set than the one I've been talking about, with keywords related to COVID-19. And what we show here is that there's very, very little reporting on this until the Wuhan lockdown in late January. And if you zoom in on this early reporting, almost all of it is very, very highly scripted. So almost all of it is actually, because we have more papers here, the clusters are larger, so we had to do a whole other validation of the number of clusters for the cutoff. Almost all of this early reporting is in huge clusters where everybody is copying the same script. And so we don't see like a preemption of this from commercial papers. Instead, we see a lot of control at the beginning and then a loosening of control after the lockdown, except for on particular topics. And we really dive in the appendix on which topics there was more control of related to COVID, which topics there was less control of after the lockdown. Okay, so in conclusion, and then I'll open it up to discussion, we identify scripted propaganda in China. We can identify this even without directives, just by knowing the pattern of how propaganda, knowing the process of how scripting works, and then also being able to identify those patterns within the news media. And we find that this is increasing in the share of total articles, it's increasing in constraint, and it's really targeting highly sensitive issues, especially ideology, but definitely not limited to ideology. So we go through in this a little bit more in the paper, where we can like identify these sort of highly scripted clusters also on things like entertainment, where you wouldn't, even though you don't see a big share of it in entertainment, you do see examples of it, right? And so our data sort of allows us to kind of zoom in on these particular issues where we see scripting where we might not even expect it. And it really reaches commercial papers. It even reaches the internet. I didn't show these results here, but we show that there's lots of scripting that appears on these online news aggregators as well. So we scraped a decade of the CINA News front page, and we find that scripted articles appear in almost 10% of their top headlines as well. So it's not just traditional media, this is also having implications for online media. And it's highly constraining of newspapers during crisis events like the COVID-19 epidemic, especially in the early days. We also have a whole study in the paper on earthquake reporting and scripting around earthquakes that is interesting. So I think the implication for the broader media is like, how do we think about, I think this has sort of a new directions enabled by these types of measurements. So can we use a similar idea of highly coordinated messaging and maybe with some ground truth data like the leaked directives to identify these information campaigns that are sort of meant to try to blend in. So thanks, and I'm looking forward to your questions and any discussion. Yeah.
Questions, comments? Okay, awesome.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I love the general narrative and story of it. It made a lot of sense, very intuitive. I know this isn't your area of expertise, but I was curious whether you think that, right now this has been shown to affect large language models, specifically things like DeepSeek being trained on Chinese, what's called Chinese data, Chinese newspapers, and so therefore prioritizing these scripts, prioritizing these kinds of things. And with studies being released showing that, at least in the United States, there is an increasing usage of artificial intelligence generated language, or at least what researchers believe is they're confident that it is generated by artificial intelligence in media and other aspects of that. Do you think that generative AI will have some general impact the next couple years on this trend of seeing an increasing number of scripted, state-driven news articles?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. So actually, we have a paper on this that we haven't posted yet, but where we link all of these newspaper articles to training data, and they're very prevalent training data, including models trained in the U.S. And we think they have a pretty big effect. And I think what's interesting is that there's a strategy aspect here. So I was just reading a news article the other day of these kind of websites that sort of are popping up that people think are linked to the Russian government, trying to sort of get more information and training data. So I think that creates an even bigger incentive for this information flooding that we see in social media and traditional media. And I think there's also something about the kind of strictness of language that we're seeing in this case, right? That could have a big effect, especially. I think it's a very important question. No.
Questions or comments or, yeah.
Hi, great talk. I really enjoyed it. My biggest question is, I know for this particular research, you're focusing from within the country, directives from the central government, but is there any way, or maybe brainstorming an approach to look at how they push out propaganda beyond their country and into other countries and how we view them kind of in a foreign policy way? Yes.
I think it's a really interesting and important question, but more difficult to study because so certainly there have been efforts on social media to try to look at coordinated information campaigns coming from many different states, including China. And a lot of those are identified from platforms, right, where they're okay, there's been a coordinated information campaign. We think we know it's coming. And they don't seem to have the same pattern, right, of this kind of overlap, at least in the data that I've seen. I think where we see a similar pattern is in the reach of Xinhua more broadly in the global space. So Xinhua is a very successful international news organization that prints articles about countries around the world, right? Where a lot of traditional media in the US has the funding has gone down in recent years, and so their reach is not as broad. And so we see one thing that we definitely see in data globally is an increase in syndication of Xinhua in newspapers around the world. That is a more, I think, a political economy-driven argument than a scripting argument, right? Where we don't think the state in that case is saying you must print Xinhua, right? But it's the availability of the news source that makes it attractive, right, for other for these other newspapers. And we might think that that could influence like narratives, right, or narrative reuse. And so I think that's a very interesting area of study, but it's really understudied quite a bit, yeah.
Other questions that folks have? So maybe I can ask one while you guys think of more questions. So I feel like I've seen like reporting about this happening in the United States. I think maybe it is being labeled as syndication, but like with a kind of political bent around like right-leaning content being kind of shared and like in a very scripted way where you can like hear different anchors saying like exactly the same things, like word for word. And I'm wondering like, how is this similar or different from that? Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting and great question. So, so there are a few ways in which political actors in the U.S. take advantage of sort of the economic model of the media in order to spread their message. So Justin Grimmer has this really great book where he looks at a very similar pattern with, so members of Congress will put out a press release, but they put it out in a way that makes it easy for the media to just reprint that as a media article rather than as a press release, right? And he shows that that's very common, right? Where a member of Congress will have a press release and the media organization will just like make it into a media article without being like, this is actually a press release from a member of Congress, right? Which is different, like they're not like forcing it. At the same time, it has very similar, they have a lot of agenda setting power in that case. It's similar, there have been these reports of, different administrations putting out like a full news clip where they have anchors and then that is just reprinted, right? And then certainly there's a lot of political party coordination where sort of the messaging is the same within a political party in order to like get it reprinted in social media or these types of things. Yeah. So certainly those, the distinction is that like there's less control, right? But as the media has less resources, there are ways in which political actors, just like Xinhua does abroad, take advantage of that for their own.
Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm curious if you've looked at applying this kind of same method to any other like countries or regions.
Yeah, we have. So like it's a little hard. I think our expertise is really looking at media in China, and so it's hard to like get the same context or the understanding of the process in the same way in other countries. But we have done a little bit of trying to understand this in Russia and how narratives also end up getting reused within U.S. media as well. And I think there's a lot of, I think that China stands out in its sort of institution and bureaucracy to control, to have government input into the state media. But I think there are a lot of potentially other places we could look at this, and online as well with coordinated information campaigns. It might be hard as like generative AI becomes more useful that they won't be exactly copied anymore. It'd be like slight variations on theme. But I think like the same concept could be applied in other cases. Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions from folks in the room? Okay. Then with that, I would say let's thank our speaker. And if you have individual questions, feel free to come up after.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, you guys. Yeah, appreciate it.